Hey everyone, this is day 4, week 4, and we continue this week with our random cell phone pick. So we've painted, just to recap, we painted the portrait of man with the hoodie. We painted Dani, big hair, big Jeff Jones hair in the sunlight. I really like that one. We painted yesterday Fer in front of a very desolate Christmas tree. It's like a dystopian, depressing Christmas. And today we'll see where it takes us. So remember, don't question the picture that you get. Just, wherever you land, just try to paint it. Try to make it feel like a painting. Try to find your way, fight your way through it. And just, really, really, with all the tools that you have at your disposal. I don't care if, you have a month of experience of painting or 20 years. Just really, really fight just to make a painting happen out of like thin air. Okay, that's the point of this week. Just have fun with it, but push yourself. Okay, so let's see what today has for us. Okay, here we go again. Let's see what Dani picks. Let's see. Okay, so it's a picture of her. I have plenty of those in my cell phone, and it's again about sunlight. But I wanted to see if I could treat it somewhat differently from that first painting we did in the first week, different light sources. I think that one I was trying to have abstract moments within very naturalistic moments of painting, and try to have the two of them kind of live side by side. I wanted to emphasize them, but I wanted to achieve like a sort of nice balance between them. In this one, though, as soon as I saw the pose, it's a very almost jagged pose. There's a ton of straight edges. Her neck is like super, super straight. There's a flat sort of diagonal in at the back of her head. And I thought, wow, this is going to be a chance to be a little more bold, maybe. There's one thing that I think, when I think how I understand myself as a painter, one of the things that I've always liked, and this is ever since I started painting, is a bold brushstroke. I've always liked the visibility of a brushstroke. And that's why I immediately had resonance with Rembrandt, for example. His decisions were in the surface of the painting. They were plain to see. You could almost do a dissection of how he painted certain things based on the sort of cumulative efforts of all those brushstrokes. And, the contrary was also true. I mean, I was sensitive to Bouguereau, let's say, which has no visible brushstrokes. I can appreciate that sort of painting where you're trying not to evidence paint. But for me personally, painting is most exciting when it is about paint, when you can actually tell it's paint. I think a painter like Bouguereau goes through great efforts to try and hide the fact that he's working with paint, and it's amazing. He gets remarkable paintings out of that insane ability that he was able to achieve. If you think about it, he is the apex of just 19th century French figurative painting, and there's nobody quite like Bouguereau after the Academy. Nobody in any country really. You could go to China, or you could go to Russia. You could stay within the U.S. You could go throughout the whole Europe, and nobody was able to paint quite like Bouguereau. I actually love a Bouguereau quote, and it's not that Dali validates Bouguereau, but it was in Salvador Dali's autobiography, or his diaries, I feel, and he says something to the effect of, well, maybe Picasso wasn't as good as we all thought, and maybe Bouguereau wasn't as bad as we all thought. And I thought that was kind of cool. But anyways, so I am very sensitive when I see a Gérôme, let's say, or a Bargue painting, or a Bouguereau painting. I always go like, wow, that's incredible. That's amazing that they can push painting to an extent that I can't imagine, that I can't conceive, because I'm not that sort of painter. So I've always been a very brushy painter. And because I realized very early that I loved brushstrokes, I loved mark making, I loved the evidence of mark making in the surface of the painting. I loved painters that were proud of the marks that they would put down, because to me it symbolized commitment. In a way, it says, this is how I was trying to solve something. And you many times can be very, very off, but the evidence is there for you to see. It's like, oh, she tried to paint that way and she left that mark. Even if the mark is, quote unquote, wrong, it gives you an idea of what the painter was trying to do when trying to solve something. And that to me is very eye-opening. It's almost like an X-ray to how painters think. And I appreciate that a lot. So because I had that sensitivity and that sort of closeness to people that, make very evident brush making, I remember the first time Max Ginsberg, our teacher, showed us a book on the Russian itinerants. And this was very weird. This was probably 97, maybe 98, maybe 97. And he brought this book in, and, this was, there were some painters there, you have to understand, there were some painters there that were never ever mentioned in any art history course that we could take in school. Because art history courses, and they still kind of do that, they're very Eurocentric. And, our art history, what we consider, the world's art history, still speaks about a ton about the Western art history, which is very, very sad. It's very, very limited. But we've always considered it art history. And for example, sadly, movements that happened in the latter part of the 19th century and the earlier part of the 20th century are like swallowed up by Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. And that's all you hear, and that's all you think happened, in the late 19th century and early 20th. But when he brought, this book where, itinerants like Ilya Repin and Kramskoy, Shishkin, Levitan, Serov, tons of painters that were just amazing. And I was like, this is new for me. This is insane. This is new. And these were paintings that were 100 years old. It's like, how, why don't we hear about these painters? Now, today, if you flash forward, today it's very easy to see a lot of these painters in courses and mentioned in blog posts, and they have Wikipedia entries, and there's tons of books. But, I remember, late 90s, and this is not, this is not like 100 years ago. This is like 20 years ago. We had to go with a couple of friends to a Russian bookstore in New York and actually order the books. Just say, oh, do you have maybe like a Repin book? And they would order the book, and it would come in, and they would, sell it to us. But it was the only place that we could get like a Repin book. I remember that's where I got my Repin book. And the other stuff we had to just like Xerox. Or, if Steve Vassell brought a book or Max Ginsberg brought a book, they would just lend it to us, and we would Xerox the book. But that was it. That was the extent of information that we had. And of course, Max contextualized it a little bit. And for those of you who don't know, the itinerants were painters that there were Russian painters that were kind of fed up with the European influence, of art in Russia, and they just fought. It was like the first kind of nationalist movement, socialist movement, and they started to fight against that European kind of pressure. And what they did was that they traveled throughout Russia trying to paint Russian motifs. It's almost like a very early propaganda painting, if you think about it that way, because they wanted to take back what was their own and to say, no, we need to make our own images. And these were painters that were for decades working. Probably since before 1880s and up until 1920s, maybe till the Bolshevik Revolution. But then afterwards, there was, that sort of the wandering movement, the itinerant movement, turned into what is basically the social realist movement. That was pure propaganda. I mean, amazing painters. It was as if Norman Rockwell had been painting in Russia. That's pretty much it. Because Rockwell, if you think, he was an incredible illustrator, but if you think about it, he was he was a propaganda painter. He was doing paintings so that America could restore its values after the wars. So in Russia, the same thing was happening. There were tons of these nationalist painters trying to bring back the essence of being Russian. And I remember just first seeing some of Repin's paintings and just being floored by them. I never thought that ability was possible outside the realms of all the European painters that we constantly heard of. So digging a little deeper, and this is years afterwards, I saw the Russian realist movement that was happening in the 20th century, and there's a ton of painters that kept with that tradition. It was insane. It was like a parallel universe, in Russia, and because they were so almost locked up, the rest of the world had no idea what they were doing, and I love that the artwork that came from almost working, inside this bubble. What's freaky about this is that if you go today in Russia to the Repin Institute to study, you are pretty much basically studying, in what is a time machine, and they are teaching the exact same course and manners of when Repin was in that institute. So it's pretty insane. It's actually kind of fascinating in that way. But again, one of the things that I appreciated most about the Russian itinerant movement that ended up being the Russian socialist realist movement was just the manner of painting. They were so bold and fearless with their strokes. Again, risking that maybe they were off, but honestly, they had such a strong academic foundation that they could draw with their brush in a very, very expressive manner. And I remember Arkhipov and the Tkachev brothers just being, perfect examples of the sort of painting that I was looking for. I was like, wow, this is, it's simplicity at its core, but it's also lush, but there's also knowledge of form, and there's also just expression in there. I thought it was just absolutely perfect painting. And what's cool about this is that we can sort of try to tie this with the West. One of the painters that was sort of part of this tail end, social revolution of painting was Fechin, Nikolai Fechin. But Fechin actually had to go to the United States. He had to, I think he was rescued by the Red Cross movement in the 1920s, like around the Bolshevik Revolution. And he actually left Russia to go to the States. And at first, I think he was, not sure where he ended up in. I think it was in the West Coast. And then he went down to New Mexico, and that's where he actually spent most of his life. But Fechin was sort of an anomaly in the States because he was a Russian that was educated, with all this Russian academic background, but working in manners that nobody in the U.S., worked like. And that's why he was so strange. But in reality, Repin is just another, and this is not, I'm not trying to minimize the quality of Repin. Repin is probably one of the best draftsmen in, 20th century. But he was another Russian. The truth is, like, there were so many Russians that had that ability. But they were in Russia. They didn't go to the States. And he is very famous, honestly, because he went to the States. And again, I'm not saying he's he was just one of many. I'm saying he was incredible, but he was part of an incredible kind of family of artists that was kind of normal in Russia at that moment. And Fechin kept this very, very brushy, expressive sort of tradition with his strokes, with the way he built up paint. And that's something that when I was painting this, I was thinking, I want to see if I can be brushy. Again, this is like a couple of hour painting, and I have to be conscious of the fact that I have to solve it. I can't just block something in and then wait a couple of days, then paint over it. No, I have to try and solve it, but I want to be bold. But I don't want it to be like just a couple of strokes and then leave it behind. Again, I want to be able to achieve the level of resolution that I want, in my initial intent. I don't want my brushstrokes to be so big that eventually I just have to kind of give up and say, okay, no, this is almost, the surface is impossible to work on. I'm going to have to leave it there. So when I was thinking about, being brushy and being bolder, I immediately went back to to the love that I have of Russian, 19th century, late 19th century, and early 20th century painting. But I thought about Fechin, and then I took it back to the States. And when I think of the U.S., and particularly movements that came, later on, really, like about maybe 30 years after, 25, 30 years after Fechin reached the States, I thought about the Bay Area painters, and I thought about David Park. And David Park is an amazing, amazing painter. He was part of this group of painters. Diebenkorn was there also, that were trying to migrate in a way from abstract expressionist painting towards figurative painting. Which, if you think about it, nowadays it doesn't seem like that's a big deal. A painter today, a contemporary painter today could fluctuate between abstraction, painting as part of installation, or very traditional painting. It doesn't matter. Honestly, today you can bend painting based on what you're trying to say, and nobody cares. Honestly, nobody cares. Painting is not tied to dogmas right now, or to movements or schools of thought. It really isn't. But in the 20th century, that wasn't as easy. It almost felt like betrayal if you were trying to go from what's considered one end of the spectrum to the other. So the Bay Area artists did that, and David Park was one of the bolder ones that went straight to figuration, and I loved it. I absolutely love his paintings, and again, they have a different quality than mine. Of course, I'm not trying to paint like him or Diebenkorn, because that's impossible. That's why we have Park and Diebenkorn. But I'm trying to pick up the things that I feel sensitive to, that I see in their paintings, and that I celebrate about their paintings. And just big masses of color, maybe oversaturating hues just to create relationships between those hues. I think that's also very very relevant in their work. So I can actually extract some of those things. Some of the things that I'm sensitive to. The important thing here is to actually reflect upon those paintings and say, okay, why am I being moved by these paintings, and how can I use those things that I'm moved by and incorporate them into what eventually is going to become my own painting. So for today, that was really it. I was really going for leaving my marks behind, sort of a testament of how what the thought process was during the painting, how I went about painting a painting that I actually love. I love paintings that can be informative, that they're almost academic in a way, because you can sense how they were constructed. I really, really, really like that. I think, as for example, like etchings can do that too, where you see every single stroke in an etching. You don't see kind of scribbles and tangled messes of lines, but you see every decision that the artist made, you can actually see in the surface. I actually appreciate that, like crazy when I see a painting, because to me, those are the ways we construct like a dialogue with the observer. And if the observer, in my case, is somebody who's actually in tune with painting, with the manner in which those those words were spoken, to say it that way, to put it that way, then I have an insane connection, just like an insane connection with paintings. I don't know if it's happened to you guys, but it happens to me sometimes when I go to museums. And I'm not saying that I can paint like any of these people in museums. That's crazy. But sometimes I see paintings and I see how these artists would solve just a little area of a painting. And I go like, oh my God, I've felt that. I've actually felt that. I've actually been there. I've actually been at that moment where I've had to solve something similar. And I've actually tried to solve it in that way too. And as soon as that happens, it's just such a weird, beautiful connection with the artist and the materials and the painting and their intent. And it's like, I know how you felt. I actually can sense how you felt. That to me is beautiful. That to me is how painting has been kept alive, throughout centuries. So those were the things that I wanted to go for with this particular one, that I think make it a little bit different. It's a little bit bolder than the one I did during my first week. I left a lot of, those kind of pure hues behind, those more geometric shapes that eventually conform the body. And I liked it. And it has tons of expression, which I always like. I never, ever want to sacrifice expression. It could be a little tea bag or a trash bag or, a cup, or in this case, Dani. I'm not saying Dani is like any of those things, but I'm just saying all of those things carry, they have a soul. They carry expression with them. And I'm never, ever willing to sacrifice any of that. So I'm pretty happy with this one too. And again, as part of the goal, you guys know that what we're trying to do is to, in a way, to try and not repeat ourselves, to sort of surprise ourselves by the range that we can have as painters. So I'm very happy with this one. So anyways, I'll see you guys tomorrow, and we'll see what Dani blindly picks for us. So I'll see you guys. Bye.